When Spain plays Cabo Verde, the scoreboard treats it as a mismatch. A European giant against a small island nation most viewers cannot place on a map. But watch what happens when the camera leaves Madrid and drops south, where the streets tighten and the atmosphere shifts almost immediately. Spain does not end at the Mediterranean. It reaches into the Atlantic as well, along coasts where the light and landscape already begin to change. It extends into the Atlantic all the way to the Canary Islands, an archipelago closer to the West African coast than to any Spanish city on the. Just off the mainland, the landscape shifts almost immediately, with the coastline giving way to a distinctly different terrain. Fuerteventura, the easternmost Canary Island, sits roughly 100 kilometres from Morocco. Barcelona is more than 2,000 kilometres away. The Canary Islands are not a holiday footnote. They are a volcanic frontier, 7 main islands rising from the Atlantic floor with peaks that reach above the clouds. And they are fully Spanish. Same laws, same currency, same European Union membership. But here is what the scoreboard does not show. 600 kilometres farther into the same Atlantic, past the coast of Mauritania and Senegal, sits another archipelago. 10 volcanic islands scattered across the Atlantic off the coast of West Africa, Cabo Verde. These islands were uninhabited until Portuguese ships arrived in the mid-15th century. No indigenous population, no prior civilization. Everything that Cabo Verde became, its people, its language, its culture, was assembled from scratch on volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. 2 island worlds, both pulled into the same Iberian Atlantic system, both shaped by the same trade winds, the same ocean currents, the same imperial ambitions. One became Spanish Europe offshore, absorbed into the mainland identity so completely that most Europeans forget it faces Africa, not the Mediterranean. The other became a Creole nation shaped by Portuguese rule, West African roots, migration, music and the sea. Same ocean, same volcanic geology, same Iberian logic of expansion, but the outcomes could not look more different. So the question this episode will answer is not really about football, even if that is the image most people picture first. It is about why 2 archipelagos off Africa, discovered and claimed by neighbouring Iberian empires within decades of each other, ended up in such radically different worlds. The map now shows 2 island worlds in the same ocean. The question is why one became Europe and the other became something no European empire fully predicted. Most people picture Spain as Madrid, Barcelona, flamenco, cathedrals and the Mediterranean coast. Except it does. Drop south from the Iberian Peninsula, past the Strait of Gibraltar, past Morocco, and you reach a chain of volcanic islands rising steeply from the Atlantic floor, isolated in the open ocean. The Canary Islands, Spanish territory, closer to the Sahara than to any city on the Spanish mainland. Fuerteventura sits roughly 100 kilometres from the Moroccan coast. That is closer than London to Paris. And yet this is Spain, the same currency, the same passports, the same EU membership. More than 15 million tourists visit the Canary Islands every year. They come for the beaches, the climate, the resorts. But almost none of them stop to think about what it means that this volcanic archipelago off West Africa is governed from Madrid. Because the Canaries were not always Spanish. Before Castilian ships arrived, these islands had their own people, the Guanche. an indigenous population that had lived on the islands for centuries, likely descended from Berber groups from North Africa. They spoke their own languages and had their own social structures. And between 1402 and 1496, Castile conquered them, island by island. It took nearly a century. The methods Castile tested in the Canaries, military conquest, land redistribution, forced conversion, plantation agriculture, would reappear across the Americas within a generation. The Canary Islands were one of Europe's first laboratories for overseas colonization, and today that history is almost invisible. What the modern visitor sees is a Spanish autonomous community. Highways, hospitals, universities, airports, all built to European Union standards. But the geography tells a different story. Stand on the southern coast of Fuerteventura on a clear day and you can see the outline of the African continent. The trade winds that blow across these islands come from the Sahara. The volcanic soil was pushed up from the same tectonic system that shaped the Atlas Mountains. And in recent decades, the Canaries have become something else, a waypoint. Small boats carrying migrants from West Africa arrive on Canary shores. Following routes that echo, in reverse, the same Atlantic currents that once carried European ships south. The islands sit at a hinge point, European by law, African by geography, Atlantic by history. Spain absorbed its Atlantic islands into the mainland identity, but farther south, a different Iberian empire was building a different kind of island world. Before these islands had national flags, they had a function. They were the infrastructure of ocean empires. In the 15th century, sailing the open Atlantic was not a straight line. Ships depended on trade winds and ocean currents that moved in enormous loops. You could not sail from Lisbon to West Africa and back without stopping. You needed fresh water. You needed food. You needed a place to wait for the wind to change. That is what Atlantic islands were for, not scenery, not settlement, logistics. Portugal understood this first. In the 1420s, Portuguese navigators reached Madeira. A decade later, the Azores. These islands became way stations. Places to resupply, to repair ships, and to test whether Europeans could grow crops on volcanic soil far from home. Without them, the route south along the African coast, past one difficult headland after another, would have been a dead end. By the 1450s, Portuguese ships reached a new archipelago. Further out, further south, hotter, drier, Cabo Verde. Uninhabited. 10 volcanic islands scattered across open ocean, roughly 600 kilometres off the West African coast. No fresh rivers on most islands, brutal dry seasons, but positioned exactly where the Atlantic wind systems converge. For Portugal, that position was worth more than fertile land. Now here is where the ocean gets divided, split by the coastline into two distinct stretches of water. In 1479, the Treaty of Alcasovas settled a war between Castile and Portugal, and part of the deal carved the Atlantic in two. Spain received the Canary Islands, Portugal received rights to everything south, the African coast, Madeira, the Azores, and Cabo Verde. This was not just a land deal, it was an ocean deal, stretching beyond the shoreline into the surrounding waters. Two Iberian powers split the Atlantic into separate corridors, each with its own chain of island stepping stones. And the way each power used its islands would shape everything that followed. Spain treated the Canaries like a province. Settlers arrived from Castile, churches went up, farms were planted. The islands became a permanent extension of the Spanish mainland, European soil that happened to sit off the coast of Africa. Portugal treated Cabo Verde differently. There were no indigenous people to conquer, no established agriculture to take over. The islands were a blank slate in a strategic location. Portugal needed them as a waypoint for ships heading to West Africa, and eventually around the Cape of Good Hope to Asia. But a waypoint needs people, and the way Portugal populated Cabo Verde would produce something no treaty ever planned for. Spain kept its islands close, folding the Canaries into the kingdom. Portugal sent its islands further into the experiment. 2 archipelagos, same ocean, same century of Iberian arrival, completely different outcomes. The Canary Islands had something Cabo Verde did not: people. The Guanches had lived on those volcanic islands for centuries before Castilian soldiers arrived. Spain conquered them, resettled the land with Iberian families, built churches that looked like churches in Andalusia, and administered the Canaries as a province. Within a few generations, the islands spoke Spanish, prayed in Spanish, and governed themselves through Spanish institutions. The Canaries became Europe, relocated into the Atlantic. Cabo Verde had no one. When Portuguese navigators reached the archipelago around 1456, every island was empty. No indigenous population, no prior civilization, no language waiting to absorb or resist the newcomers. Everything that Cabo Verde would become had to be built from zero. Portugal did not send farming families to Cabo Verde. It sent administrators, merchants, and missionaries. And it brought enslaved West Africans here to work the land and labour along the busy port waterfront. The islands sat at a crossroads of Atlantic trade routes, and Portugal used them as a way station. Ships stopped at Santiago to resupply, trade, and to buy and sell enslaved people in crowded public markets, often in the centre of town. The settlement that anchored this system was Ribeira Grande, now known as Cidade Velha. Founded on Santiago in the 1460s, it is widely regarded as the oldest European established settlement in the tropics. A stone church, a fortress overlooking the harbour, and a pelourinho, a pillory column, stood at its centre. Ships from Lisbon arrived carrying European goods. Ships from the West African coast arrived carrying human beings. And from this convergence, something unexpected began to form. Because there was no prior population, the society that emerged on these islands was entirely new. Portuguese settlers occupied the top, enslaved Africans formed the labouring majority. Between them, a growing mixed population developed, people who belonged fully to neither continent. They were not Portuguese, they were not West African. They were becoming something else, no longer just part of the old world around them, but part of a changing landscape taking shape before their eyes. Over generations, this in-between space produced its own culture, its own cuisine, its own religious practices layered with Catholic forms and West African memory, its own social codes. And, most decisively, its own language, a Creole tongue that borrowed Portuguese vocabulary but restructured it through West African grammar. This is the fork that defines everything that follows. Spain absorbed the Canary Islands and made them a province. Today, a resident of Tenerife votes in Spanish elections, carries a Spanish passport and uses the euro. Portugal built Cabo Verde as a trade outpost, and the people who lived there, over centuries of mixing labour, faith, and adaptation, invented an identity that no empire had planned for. The Canaries became a region of Spain. Cabo Verde became a language, a rhythm, and eventually a country. What does a country sound like when every person in it descends from someone who crossed the ocean? Portuguese is the official language of Cabo Verde, but it is not what Cabo Verdeans speak to each other. Walk through any town on Santiago or São Vicente, listen at a market stall, overhear a family on a doorstep, and the language you hear is Kriolu. Most outsiders have never heard of it, and many who have assume it is simply broken Portuguese, a simplified dialect that never became a proper language. That assumption is wrong. Kriolu is a fully formed Creole language with its own grammar, its own verb system, and its own internal logic. Linguists classify it as a Portuguese-based Creole, but its roots reach deeper than any single European source. When the first Portuguese administrators arrived on these uninhabited islands in the 15th century, they brought the language of the crown. But the people who actually populated the archipelago, enslaved West Africans, maritime workers, traders from the Senegambian coast, brought their own languages too. And in the space between official command and ordinary daily life, something new began to take shape in the streets. Kriolu was not planned. No academy designed it. It grew out of necessity, out of proximity, out of the daily reality of people from different worlds living on the same volcanic rock. Portuguese provided much of the vocabulary. West African languages shaped the grammar, the rhythm, the sentence structure. And the result was a language that belonged fully to neither continent, shaped instead in the port cities and trading routes between them. Here is what makes this duality so persistent. Portuguese never disappeared. It remained the language of government, of schools, of legal documents, of formal occasions. But Kriolu became the language of everything else. The language you speak at home, the language you joke in, the language you argue in, the language you... Birdsong carries through the air here, echoing across the surrounding landscape and giving the scene a quiet sense of life. A child in Praia might learn Portuguese in the classroom and speak Kriolu the moment the bell rings. This is not a transitional phase. It has been this way for centuries. And the debate about whether to make Kriolu an official language alongside Portuguese has been ongoing for decades. Standardization efforts do exist, aiming to bring more consistency across places that still often use different systems. But the question of which island's variant becomes the standard is itself a map of Cabo Verdean identity, because Kriolu sounds different on Santiago than it does. On São Vicente, the island home to Mindelo, its lively port city, where colourful colonial buildings line the waterfront. Compare this to the Canary Islands. When Spain absorbed the Canaries, it brought Castilian Spanish. The indigenous Guanche languages faded within generations. Today, the Canary Islands speak Spanish, the same administrative language, the same intimate language, the same language of jokes and songs. In Cabo Verde, that merger never happened. The colonial language stayed on one shelf, the people's language stayed on another. And the distance between those two shelves is the clearest evidence that Cabo Verde did not simply absorb its colonizers' identity, it invented its own. If Kriolu is the private language of Cabo Verde, then its music is the public one, the sound that carried this small country across the world. If the Atlantic created Cabo Verde, then Cabo Verde's answer to the Atlantic is music. On the island of São Vicente in the northwest of the archipelago sits Mindelo, a port city wrapped around a deep natural harbour. For centuries, ships stopped here to refuel. British coal depots turned it into a crossroads. Sailors, merchants, languages and rhythms passed through its streets. Mindelo became Cabo Verde's cultural capital, not the political capital, that is Praia, on Santiago, but the place where the country's musical identity took shape. The genre most associated with Cabo Verde is morna. It is often compared to Portuguese fado, but the comparison misses the point. Fado mourns a lost golden age, an empire remembered. Morna mourns a departure that keeps happening. Its lyrics circle around saudade, a word close to the Portuguese saudade but specific to Cabo Verde. The ache of distance from a place you may never return to and the pull to go back anyway. Morna is built on acoustic guitar, cavaquinho, violin and voice. Its tempo is slow, its melodies are simple, but its emotional architecture is precise. It maps the exact feeling of standing on a harbour dock, watching someone leave, knowing you might be next. But morna is only one layer. Cabo Verde produced at least 4 distinct music traditions, each rooted in different islands, social settings and emotional registers. Coladera is the upbeat counterpart to morna, dance music, social commentary, humour and celebration born in Mindelo and São Vicente. Funana comes from Santiago, the oldest island. Played on accordion and a metal scraper called a farinho, it was associated with rural life and African-descended communities. Portuguese colonial authorities reportedly suppressed Funana as too African, too uncontrolled. After independence in 1975, Funana became a symbol of cultural pride. Then there is Batuque, a circle of women on Santiago singing call and response over rhythmic clapping and percussion. Where morna turns inward, Batuque turns outward. Where morna whispers across the harbour, Batuque commands the room. 4 traditions, 10 islands, fewer than 600,000 people on those islands. For its size, Cabo Verde may be one of the most musically dense nations on Earth, with music woven through daily life across these Atlantic islands. The person who carried this sound far beyond the Cape Verde archipelago, from these Atlantic islands to listeners around the world, was Cesária Évora. Born in Mindelo in 1941, she grew up singing morna in harbour bars for almost no money. For decades, her career barely existed outside the islands. Then, in her late 40s, a French producer heard her voice. By the 1990s, she was performing in concert halls across the world. She won a Grammy in 2004. She became known as the Barefoot Diva. Cesária Évora did not invent morna, but she made the Atlantic audible to the world. When audiences in Paris, Lisbon or New York heard her voice, they were hearing the harbour, the wind, the departure. And the constant pull to return home, a force that still shapes Cabo Verdean life across the islands and far beyond them. The music explains the emotion, but the reason so many songs are about leaving has a geographic cause that postcards never show. The prettiest island photographs hide the harshest geographic fact. For centuries, the weather decided who stayed and who had to leave. Look at the Cabo Verde archipelago from above, and the volcanic peaks are stunning. Dark rock meeting deep blue ocean, terraced hillsides carved by generations of farmers. But those stone terraces were built to catch something these dry islands rarely deliver: rain running down the slopes. Cabo Verde sits in the Sahel zone of the Atlantic. Some of its islands receive less than 250 millimeters of rainfall per year. To put that in context, London receives more than twice that amount. Parts of Sal and Boa Vista can go entire years without meaningful precipitation. This is not occasional bad luck. In places like this, it is the baseline people live with every day. And here is where the contrast with the Canary Islands sharpens again. The Canaries have enough elevation and moisture to sustain agriculture, tourism and settlement at European standards. Cabo Verde has almost none of those advantages. The volcanic soil is rich, but without water it produces almost nothing. And when the rains failed entirely, the consequences were catastrophic across the region, as fields dried out and entire communities lost their harvests. Between the 1770s and the 1940s, Cabo Verde experienced repeated cycles of drought and famine. Some estimates place the death toll from the 1940s famine alone in the tens of thousands. Portugal, the colonial power, was often slow to respond. Aid shipments were delayed. Investment in water infrastructure was minimal. The islands were administratively Portuguese, but in practical terms, when the rain stopped, the people of Cabo Verde were largely on their own. This is the fact that postcard imagery never shows. The beauty of these volcanic islands sits on top of an environmental reality so harsh that it reshaped the entire national character. Because once drought became a pattern people could see season after season, leaving home became the more logical choice. Migration in Cabo Verde did not begin as an individual adventure, it became a family system. Households would designate which members would go abroad. Those who left sent money back. Those who stayed used the remittances to survive until the next departure. Over generations, this pattern hardened into something structural. Migration was not a break from Cabo Verdean life, it was Cabo Verdean life. Families planned for it the way farming families elsewhere planned for planting seasons. The difference is that in Cabo Verde, the harvest was often a person leaving. And when people left, they didn't vanish. They carried Kriolu, they carried morna, they carried recipes, family obligations, and a specific way of being Cabo Verdean. Drought pushed people out, but where they went and what they carried turned a small island country into something much larger. On the map, Cabo Verde has fewer than 600,000 people, but the map only counts the islands. By some estimates, more Cabo Verdeans and their descendants live abroad than on the archipelago itself, in Lisbon, in New England, in the Netherlands, in France, and across West Africa, from busy coastal cities along the Atlantic to inland communities farther from the shore. Think about what that means. A country where the population beyond the borders may be larger than the population within them. The previous chapter showed why people left: drought, famine, and the environmental arithmetic of volcanic islands with almost no rain. But this chapter is about where they went and what happened when they got there. The largest Cabo Verdean community in Europe is in Portugal, and specifically in Lisbon. The connection is obvious. Shared colonial history, a shared language route in Portuguese, and direct flights that have run for decades, linking these cities through the same busy airport routes year after year. Entire neighbourhoods in the Lisbon metropolitan area carry the sound of Kriolu, the taste of cachupa, and the rhythm of music that crossed the ocean in suitcases and memory, carried from crowded docks into new neighbourhoods. But Lisbon is not the only node. Rotterdam has a significant Cabo Verdean community. So does Paris. And in West Africa, particularly in Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verdean families have maintained ties that predate independence. The most surprising node sits entirely across the Atlantic, on the other side of the ocean from the rest. In the 19th century, American whaling ships operating off the West African coast began recruiting sailors from the Cabo Verde Islands. These men knew the Atlantic, They knew wind, current, and the labour of the sea, and when the ships returned to New England, many of those sailors stayed. They settled in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, in cities like New Bedford, Providence, and Brockton, and they did not disappear. They built churches, mutual aid societies, and cultural organisations. They brought Kriolu into American neighbourhoods decades before most Americans had heard of Cabo Verde. That community persists today, still visible in the local streets, traditions, and daily life. It is one of the oldest continuous Cabo Verdean diaspora populations anywhere in the world, rooted not in 20th century migration but in the 19th century Atlantic economy. Across all of these nodes, the same patterns repeat. Remittances flow back to the islands, forming a significant share of Cabo Verde's economy. Phone calls and video calls keep families connected across time zones, from late-night check-ins in one home to early morning greetings in another. Return visits, sometimes for festivals, sometimes for funerals, sometimes just for summer, maintain a living circuit between diaspora and homeland. And wherever the diaspora settles, from busy market streets to quiet neighbourhood kitchens, two things travel with it. Kriolu, which becomes the portable marker of belonging, the sound that makes a room in Rotterdam or a kitchen in Providence feel like Santiago or São Vicente. And music. Morna, coladeira, funana. These are not just cultural exports. They are the emotional infrastructure of a scattered nation. This changes what Cabo Verde is on a map. The political boundary shows 10 islands in the Atlantic. But the lived country stretches from Praia to Lisbon to New Bedford to Rotterdam to Dakar. The nation is not contained by its coastline. A country built by people who crossed the ocean now exists partly across it, carried by language, music, remittances, and the constant pull of return. The scoreboard still says Spain versus Cabo Verde, but after everything we have crossed, the Canary Islands, the treaties, Cidade Velha, Kriolu, Morna, drought. And diaspora, that scoreboard reads differently now. Behind one flag stands a country of roughly 47 million people, a mainland empire that stretched into the Atlantic and absorbed its offshore islands into Europe. The Canary Islands vote in Spanish elections, use the euro and send representatives to Madrid. They are Spain. Behind the other flag stands a country of fewer than 600,000 people on its islands, and possibly as many again scattered across Lisbon, New England. The Netherlands and France, two neighbouring countries with distinct landscapes and cultures. And West Africa, where Atlantic-facing coasts and busy port cities shape daily life and regional trade. A country that was uninhabited until the 15th century and then became a Creole society that no single empire could fully define. Football is one of the few arenas where these two realities share the same rectangle of grass under the same rules. For 90 minutes, the pitch becomes a temporary geography, a place where diaspora meets mainland, where island memory meets European infrastructure. The Canary Islands gave Spain a frontier it rarely thinks about. Cabo Verde gave the Atlantic a voice it carries to this day. The scoreboard will record a result. One team will win, the other will lose, and by the next news cycle the fixture will dissolve into statistics. But the Atlantic between these two countries does not reset. It holds the roots that made the Canary Islands Spanish and Cabo Verde something else. A Creole nation built from crossings that no single empire fully controlled, it holds the language that was never supposed to become a language. and the music that turned exile into an art form, carried from small clubs and crowded neighbourhoods to listeners across the world. It holds the drought that emptied islands and the departures that filled foreign cities with Cabo Verdean voices, songs and family connections. And it holds the return, the pull that brings people back to volcanic harbours, to Kriolu conversations, to the sound of a morna at dusk in Mindelo. Spain and Cabo Verde share an ocean that most maps show as empty space. But the space between them is one of the fullest, most human-shaped stretches of water on Earth. The match was never random, the map just needed to move.